Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising on the 24th day of January. Welcome to our global audience. I hope you all had a good weekend. We want to celebrate today the International Day of Education. And we want to think of our educators around the world who carry the very precious and important responsibility of leading our young people and learners of all ages into deeper awareness of the world around us, character that we need to build so that we can comport ourselves ethically and responsibly. So today we want to honor our educators, those teachers amongst us who have taken on this very sacred trust of curating the learning of the next generation so that we can secure not only the wisdom from the past, but so that we can prepare our young people for the mindsets and the tool sets and the skill sets that they need to navigate a particularly challenging world at the moment. We're nearly 2 years into COVID. Education, as much, if not more than any other sector, has been put in a state of turbulence and uncertainty. Do the kids go to school? Do they not go to school? What are the health protocols for millions and millions of young people around the world? And around the COVID pandemic is the hypercomplexity of our modernity. So education is a complex mission that we want to honor today. Before we begin our program, let us just pause as we always do and just take a moment and center yourself in your heart, just for a minute. Be in your body. Be in your heart. And today, let's just think of all the teachers we know, all the educators we know, all the students in schools that we know, and send love, send care for just a minute. Thank you, everyone. My mind went back to some of the teachers I had when I was a child, surprisingly enough, and made me realize also that mothers, fathers, life are among the greatest teachers of all. We all have a collective responsibility. It takes a village, literally, to raise a child. So I want to honor the village as we start our programming today, and also recognize that young people in particular have been challenged with the pandemic, particularly in terms of their mental health, suicide rates, drug rates, domestic violence, social alienation have all been radically, dramatically increasing during the 2 years now of COVID. So that's the subject that we're going to dive into today on the 24th of January. And I want to recognize one of our principal partners in Humanity Rising, Masterpiece, one of the most extraordinarily dynamic and powerful youth organizations in the world that brings young people for many years now together in a highly sophisticated and nuanced way to take personal responsibility, collective responsibility for major issues emanating from the challenge to create peace on earth. Masterpiece has convened a number of panels over the course. We're approaching almost 400 sessions on Humanity Rising now. I think it's 397 today. So I just want to honor all of you out there that are associated with Masterpiece, but also other youth organizations that are tuning in today, and again, educators. And in that spirit, I want to turn it over to Marlene Burson, who works with Masterpiece and has been the convener, the curator of our session today. So Marlene, thank you so much for everything you've done to bring this panel into formation. And I turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for this lovely introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy that you join us on this International Day of Education and celebrating whole child development and in particular mental well-being of youth. We're almost over 2 years now in this pandemic situation, putting pressure on all sorts of topics, but especially mental well-being of youth, as we also hear from our community, local change makers in more than 44 countries. And we are part of an international global learning community on whole child development. And we've been working the last 2 months preparing this webinar. So we all agreed that mental well-being and talking about it, learning about it, taking action as educators in formal and non-formal education is important. And we really believe that if we join forces and co-create, we can solve one of many challenges, and maybe all challenges. So this is also an invitation for you as audience to listen and to all our wonderful experts we have in this session. And yeah, hopefully this is the start of something great, and it will turn out into concrete actions, because you know it takes you and me, and we all need to act. So that being said, I would like to give the floor to my colleague from the Teacher Foundation in India, Maya, because we prepared a small survey amongst our network, so amongst our educators, just to get a snapshot of what's going on now in the world. So Maya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marlene, and welcome to the session from India. I'm just going to share my screen. Marlene, just let me know if it's coming on. Yeah. So as a preparation for this webinar, we did a short pre-webinar survey of teachers, and we had about over 850 teachers from different parts of the world who actually filled up the survey. It was just a very quick, short survey of just 5 or 6 questions. And these are some of the results we got from the survey. One of the questions we asked was, what are the challenges faced by teachers during the pandemic? And 55% of them said coping with teaching online, which was a completely different medium to what teachers are normally used to. Helping other colleagues teach online, 28% said. Providing students both in-person and online classes, hybrid modes, 41% said. Coping with student engagement and learning, because that was what they were struggling with, the fact that they couldn't see children physically. And most of the children were either, muted video, their videos were muted as well as audios were muted. 50% of teachers said that. Looking into physical health of and safety of teachers and staff, 32% said. And looking into social emotional well-being of staff, 29% said. Looking into physical health and safety of students, more teachers felt they were more preoccupied with that. 44% vis-a-vis 32% in terms of their own physical health. And looking into social emotional well-being of students, 47% said that that was the biggest challenge. And of course, about a third of them talked about financial constraints. One area that has been most impacted by the pandemic, that was another question we asked, and 39% of the teachers said student learning and engagement. Extracurricular activities, 24% said, and to a lesser extent, student well-being. And I feel perhaps it's also because teachers were still hadn't really understood the import of how the pandemic has possibly affected student well-being. Curricular aspects was less, 8%, teacher well-being and parental engagement, 6% each, and looking at other pedagogical approaches to teaching, 7%. So this is just giving you a snapshot, bird's eye view of what teachers have said. I'm just going to move on, and oops, I think okay, I think I have, sorry, it's gone, yeah. So another question we asked was, have you asked your students about their thoughts and feelings? And 92% of them said yes, and only 8% said no. I'm sorry, I think I may have missed a couple of slides, but oh yes, I've missed a lot of slides. I apologize. Yeah, we finished this. So another question we asked was, has our school management asked you about your thoughts and feelings? 80% said yes, and 20% said no. And what are some of the unmet needs you have had, and how has it impacted your teaching learning, was a question we asked. Different teachers, we had 850 responses, but we just took a few. Teacher well-being is neglected. Expectations from teachers has always been high. It was quite frustrating to see that students refuse to turn their video camera. I felt like teaching lessons was rather a monologue. I was really worried about some students. It made me focus more on well-being than on school stuff. As a principal, I feel for the teachers' financial and emotional condition. Yes, students are suffering, but it is the teachers who have lost most. A few responses. There was one teacher who wrote such a lot, so I'm just going to read it very quickly. Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, building their communications skills, etc., has been hampered during the pandemic. Children's social and emotional needs are completely being neglected at the moment. This has hit some students hard, with some finding themselves living completely alone. Two-way interaction sometimes gets difficult to implement. The stress the pandemic has put on families with rising levels of cases and financial insecurity, combined with the stay-at-home orders, has put a strain on mental health. The need to connect with students and parents to understand the reason for high absenteeism. And another teacher said, deeply dissatisfied feeling regarding one's ability to facilitate the learning process. 11% of teachers actually said they didn't have any particular impact, no impact at all. And 5% mentioned the recurring internet issues. So another question I asked, which I already shared with you, was, have you asked your students? And only 8% said no, that they haven't asked their students about their thoughts and feelings. However, if you were to, I'll just proceed. What do you think were students' predominant concerns? Most of them said meeting and talking to friends and classmates. 61% of teachers felt that was a big concern. Not being able to play with classmates was 38%. Doing exams online was 33%, and having to work without a break, 21%, loss of loved ones, 25%, and anxiety about the future, 31%. And what are some of the ways in which schools are handling students' SEL, social emotional learning concerns? 54% said they have weekly meetings to understand their needs and address them. However, you will notice right at the bottom, 17% actually said haven't really had time to look into teachers and students' social emotional needs actively. And of course, we had regular one-on-one sessions, 29% saying that, and collaborating with external partners to address student socio-emotional needs, 23%. So I'm just coming to the end, just a couple more slides. What do you think, therefore, one of the questions we asked was, last question we asked was, do you think, what do you think are the top 5 indicators of a great school system? 65% said students being motivated to learn with interest. 59% said social emotional learning of students. 52% said discipline. Continual assessment with formative feedback, 49% said that. Student achievement in co-curricular activities, 43% said that. And learning that is collaborative and social, 39% said that. Sensitivity to individual differences, 41% said that. Fostering of life skills oriented learning, 38% said that. And of course, carefully planned teacher personal and professional development, 43% said that. So on that note, I want to hand over back to Marlene. Thank you. This was a quick survey that we did. Yeah.
Thank you, Maya, for sharing these statistics. Hopefully everyone can hear me. We would now like to, hey, there I am again, I guess. So we would now like to show the video we prepared with some statements from teachers and students. So if Mark, can you start that video?
Coming up, here we go.
Thank you. And then after that, we will move to the presentation from Bassam from UNICEF. No sound.
Check the lower left corner of your share screen to turn the audio on.
Yeah, coming up.
Click the audio in the lower left corner of your share screen. Marlene, I think I should stop this share and we can move on. It's up to you.
Oh, sorry, Mark, are you able to stop sharing and reshare again with sound? You're still there? Yeah, okay. I don't hear him. So yeah, I agree. Let's stop
Okay,
screen share.
Here you go.
We'll try it again at the end. No worries. Thank you. So now I would like to introduce Bassem. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let's see. And is it on presentation mode now?
No, we don't see your screen yet.
Oh, you don't see my screen yet. Okay, let's see. Okay, hold on for a sec. I got it. Oops, I closed the presentation by accident.
No problem.
Okay, and voila. Okay, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, colleagues. Can you see my screen right now?
Yeah, you're good.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you so much for hosting such an important webinar. My name is Bassem Nasser. I'm an education specialist at UNICEF headquarters based in New York. And today I want to just share with you maybe just a quick 10 minutes about UNICEF's, about the status of basically schools in the time of COVID-19 and what opportunities we have to support children in skills development and in mental health, something that's really extremely important right now to do within COVID. Okay, let's see. Next, how do I do next? Okay. So, colleagues, the situation is really not that very good. UNICEF in 2021 published a report called The State of the World's Children. Some of the figures that have really highlighted the need and the dire situation in terms of mental health. Estimated more than 13% of adolescents live with diagnosed mental disorder, as defined by the WHO. So this actually represents about 86 million young people between 15 and 19, and about 80 million adolescents between 10 and 14. As some of the colleagues mentioned before, anxiety and depression make about 40% of these diagnosed mental disorders. Also, as mentioned before, suicide is the fourth leading cause of death for girls and boys aged 15 to 19. And so, really, really also pretty disturbing. Children and young people have also been reporting psychosocial distress that does not rise to the level of basically a disorder, but that actually really is disruptive of their life. So as you can see, and most importantly, whether countries are rich or poor, whether young people are living in humanitarian or development contexts, basically mental health conditions and the lack of caring responses are still the cause of significant suffering for children and adolescents. So this is sort of the bleak situation of young people right now in the world. Add to that is we now have schools closure and learning loss. So for educators, but also for parents and children themselves, one of the most pressing consequences of the global responses has been the escalation of school closures globally. So fresh figures, as of 12th of January 2022, more than 630 million school children were still affected by the partial or full school closure. And so with the Omicron variant, governments across the world are considering closing their schools once again and are still closing their schools. So this is now the Omicron variant, but just reflecting a little bit about what's happened. Today we're heading into the 100th week of the pandemic. On average, each country has experienced nearly 20 weeks of full school closures, plus another 20 weeks of partial school closures. So with a tremendous sort of learning loss. So basically, here are some of the worrying figures. 24 million additional students may drop out of school system. 370 million children have already missed out on school meals, and we also know how that is impactful on the mental health and the learning of children. 10 million more girls are at a risk of early marriage, and we are expecting about $17 trillion loss in future earnings to be borne by the current generation of learners. So what does that mean actually for us? And this has been UNICEF's, this is UNICEF's position, and that we advocate for globally with governments, with donors, with UN institutions, with foundations. Schools and learning environments are regarded as the ideal platform to support children's social emotional learning and promote their mental health and psychosocial. So they must remain open. Schools are also more than just places where children learn. So for many children, schools provide an opportunity to be supported by their peers and teachers, develop their skills, a place of safety and nutrition, and a place where they can get structure and routine in their lives. So schools must be open to ensure children continue learning and thriving. And we must prioritize this. We must prioritize the schools reopening whenever we are doing something, whenever we're designing policies by governments. I want to finally leave you with some thoughts about how we can basically, once schools open, how we can basically support children's skills development and social emotional learning and mental health in schools, since this is actually very much focused on schools. So the idea basically here is let's reopen in schools. But once we reopen schools, let's really care about some of those things, integrating skills into their curricula. So when I talk about skills, I'm talking about social emotional skills, life skills. They're an extremely important part of any intervention that targets the mental health of children. Promote an open culture around mental health between the teachers, between the parents, between the school administrators, and between the students, so that children can actually feel safe and protected, and we can start addressing some of the issues that they are dealing with, and that we can somehow support their learning. What we can do is also we can promote participation in schools and learning environments where children need opportunities to express their opinions and exercise their agency in decisions that affect them. I'll give you an example basically here in terms of what UNICEF is doing. In Armenia, basically UNICEF supported adolescent girls and boys to present to local authorities strategies and suggested tools for meeting participation in policy and community development through education. And basically were basically voiced out their questions or recommendation into including life skills and 21st century skills into the curriculum. And finally, very apt to this webinar today, I think it's really important to support teachers' well-being. Teachers are sort of the cornerstone of teaching and learning and education process, and we certainly believe this at UNICEF. And we're doing so many interventions working with teachers in terms of capacity development, but also improving their own mental health well-being in terms of promoting their job satisfaction, mental health and well-being, and access to professional development opportunities. A lot can be done, and I think maybe after the webinar, we will share with you some resources that would be more than happy for you guys to look at. But finally, I'd like to share a video that really basically highlights some of the work that we've been doing around mental health and equipping students with better mental health. Where is the video? Next. And this is a video that comes to us from Ecuador. I'm going to play it, and hopefully you guys can hear the volume. It's really inspirational and refreshing.
Para venir a encontrarme acá con la maestra de la casa de mi mamita, dejamos subidos los caballos y hay un recorrido de 6 horas en los caballos. Pues por el clima ahorita a veces los tiramos 7 horas, pues depende del clima como esté. Y salimos a veces de madrugada, salimos a la 1 y acá llegamos a las 6, a veces. Pero cuando nos toca salir de tarde, pues salimos a la 1 de la tarde y llegamos a las 6. Bueno, lo bueno es que ella me explica todo. Me va explicando paso a paso los detalles y todo. Bueno, y lo malo es que no tengo compañeros con quien jugar, con quien compartir como lo hacía antes.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to drop off in about 10 minutes, but it's been really an honor presenting to you. And if there are any questions that I'm unable to answer because I'm unavailable, I'm sure we can get back to colleagues via email. Many thanks to you, Marlene.
Thank you, Bassem, for joining our webinar and this interesting presentation and video. And what stuck to me is one of your points that we also need to take care of our mental well-being of our educators. It reminds me of this metaphor in the airplane, right? Where you get instructions when something goes on and the oxygen drops down. You first have to put on your own oxygen before you put on your children's oxygen. And I think this is maybe also an interesting topic for the panel discussion. How do we make sure that also our educators, the people, hoping to give the children, new insights and lessons to learn, that they are well enough to also provide this. So, and that being said, I would like to give the floor to another researcher, Manolia. And she is a senior researcher at the American Institute for Research and author of the OECD Education Working Paper. It's a mouthful. Improving education outcomes for students who have experienced trauma and/or adversity. So I think this is more of a deep dive into, okay, what can schools do?
Stand up. Stand up.
Manolia, are you there?
Bugger.
Hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
We
I
can
don't know
hear
what
and
that
see you.
background voice was. That wasn't coming from me. Let me share my screen. Okay.
I like that how you start with the end.
Okay, so this is the first slide. And
yes, we can see it. Yes, yeah. Perfect.
Hello, everyone. And I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I realize that we are joining this webinar from all different time zones. And I so much appreciate the diversity among our panelists and all the, I'm sure the participants who are joining from around the world. I am here today to talk a little bit about our working paper that we, if I can get my mouse active, that we prepared for OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in 2020. And that was right when COVID was very new. Our knowledge around COVID was just emerging. So this paper we were asked to do focused or summarize best evidence on causes and effects of adversity and trauma that students experience, factors that exacerbate or reduce the effects of adversity and trauma, and effective educational practices. I just dropped in the link to our paper that is stored on OECD's iLibrary, and also a summary on our website, AAR's website, if you're interested in. Today, I don't want to talk about the details. I have just 10 minutes. So I would like to give you just like an overview of what we covered in our paper, and hopefully I'll leave you with some questions and some resources. I'm a senior researcher from American Institute for Research. AAR is a nonprofit organization that conducts behavioral and social science research and delivers technical assistance for the most urgent challenges in the US and around the world. And I'm joining you from Virginia, US. So it's around 11:35 my time. Childhood is not an adventure that we choose. It is influenced by the adults around us and the communities within which we reside. I like this image that I saw in another presentation because it really shows how complex child development is and how complex our lives are, that we get influenced by so many different effects that we necessarily do not choose. We all experience some level of stress in our lives, right? We also may deal with traumatic experiences such as this pandemic that everyone is experiencing for the last 2 years. For many children, these experiences do not have serious or ongoing effects, and in fact can build resilience. But even though a tolerable level of stress is good to have kids develop their coping skills, if stress is persistent accumulative, and if it's not addressed adequately over time, it may have detrimental effects on the social, emotional, and physical well-being of the individual child, and long-term economic and health impacts on our societies. And I think Basem's presentation really showed the dire numbers that we need to think about as a result of the effect of the pandemic. Let me just share a little bit about what we covered in our paper and describe you what I mean by childhood adversity, traumatic event, and trauma. So childhood adversity is a broad term that refers to a wide range of circumstances and events at home, school, or community, or within the larger society that are experienced as a threat to a child's physical or psychological sense of safety and well-being. It may include the child's home environment, the extreme poverty. That video was really inspiring and so effective, thinking about the comparison to my child who's just joining the computer and instruction from home. Living in foster care or orphanages, community or school-based violence, living in a marginalized group, and events that we are experiencing on and off. A traumatic event is an event that is perceived by the individual as extremely frightening, harmful, or threatening to self or others. A trauma is the emotional, psychological, and physiological residue that from heightened levels of stress that accompany experiences of danger, violence, significant loss, and life-threatening events that elicit our survival mechanisms that are unnecessary in other contexts, and think about the effects of COVID on our well-being. I also want to mention that this is our topic today. As much as school is meant to be a positive environment, or schooling is meant to be a positive environment, it can also have negative effects on child development. This, of course, is really thinking about education in general, before also what we knew about education. The discriminatory behaviors directed against students, their families, and communities, the unsupportive environments such as bullying, violence, or intimidation a child might experience, punitive discipline practices such as suspension or expulsion, and lack of effective and timely support. And on top of these experiences that the students may experience, maybe think about the effect of COVID now, the isolation from their friends, teachers, and other supportive adults that the kids used to interact on a regular basis in the school environment, the financial and social and emotional stresses within the family, violence some kids are experiencing now that the parents are home, the grief, fear, and uncertainty. So it adds a lot to child well-being. Adverse and traumatic experiences affect how young people think, feel, and behave. It has an effect on impaired cognitive functioning, such as memory and attention, how well the kids can pay attention to the learning material. And it impacts learning experience, difficulty regulating emotions and emotional responses, interacting with other peers, as well as mental and physical health. And the effects differ depending on how severe the experience is, how personal the experience is, the duration, and if it accumulates over time through multiple stressful experiences. But what I really want to come to is the effects of diversity and trauma will vary by each individual, but it is not destiny, right? There are many things that we are learning through research, the research on resilience, that the resilience and the effect on adverse and traumatic experiences really depends on child's individual characteristics, but also on the community, and can really be mediated through the assets that exist in the community, the supports and the resources. And that's what we should really focus on. The key message is that trauma is not destiny. Trauma and adversity does not mean that the kids, we are doomed. Yes, it is true that adverse life experiences put a lot of pressure on us, on our well-being, but what matters is to create and leverage the resources and support in the environment to support the individual. Think about the people in your life who cared about you. That's what we need to focus on in this work, and develop a narrative that focuses what we have rather than what we don't have. So that's also where we are really learning. We have a lot of knowledge, as Bassem said, but now it's time to act on what we know, and think about how can we leverage the resources and the supports and the assets around us to help us build more resilience so we can overcome the effects of the pandemic. And the schools and educators have a key role in this. So research shows that there are three key strategies that are really effective. One is teaching, building students' social and emotional skills, such as self-regulation, self-efficacy, conflict resolution, helping the child build a growth mindset. And these skills, learning of these skills or teaching of these skills can start before the school and continue also during schooling time. Ensuring that every child, every student has stable adults in their lives. And it starts with parents, but it also includes mentors, teachers, staff in the school, and community members. And it's important that these adults role model responsibility, constructive relationships, expressing their emotions appropriately. Even asking the child, how are you, makes a huge difference in building resilience. And of course, providing safe and equitable learning environments. Think about, and that's what we talk in our working paper, the anti-bullying policies, cyberbullying policies that states and school systems have created, alternative approaches to suspensions in schools instead of applying punitive disciplinary practices, and creating a sense of belonging that gives the message to educators and teachers, students, that we hear you, we understand you, and we value your needs. So everyone in the schooling system, and this includes not the students, but also the educators, the adults, I am safe, I feel loved, and I feel heard. Yeah, and I think Marlene and Maya have mentioned this, we should not forget our educators, right? They are also experiencing a lot of trauma in their lives, but also secondary trauma by observing all the things that the students are going through. And it helps, it just leads to fatigue and burnout. But few education systems prepare teachers to recognize and respond appropriately to the effects of trauma and adversity among students. And this is, I think, really nice, the way Marlene put it. If you are on a plane, you will watch the flight attendant show how you first need to put the air mask on yourself before helping out your child, right? So it's really important that we think about the needs of our educators and well-being before we can also think about the child well-being. These are some key school practices and policies we talk in our paper. School policies for training and supporting educators to improve their trauma-informed practices and student social emotional learning, as well as educators' well-being. These include building educators' well-being awareness of what trauma means and how students demonstrate their traumatic experiences in many different ways in the school or in online virtual learning environment. Providing educators with the supports and skills so they can address their own needs as well as students' needs. Student needs assessment that are culturally, contextually, and developmentally sensitive. Student screening that enables early and accurate identification of issues without cultural or other biases. So these assessments are not focusing on what's wrong with you, but tell me what happened to you, and identify the supports and resources that we need to help kids. Strengths-based school engagement with student, family, and communities include practices to ensure student voice and leadership. So we also ask students how they feel. Culturally relevant communications with parents. Cross-sector partnerships to leverage and build community resources. And long-term resilience is also enhanced by systemic and multi-sectorial approaches that engage all levels of society and sectors, including parents and community. By multi-tiered approaches, I'm talking about the different kinds of programs and practices that can be used in a school to address the needs of kids at different levels. Not all child in the school have the same levels of needs, right? So really understanding what they need at different levels and thinking about supports and resources we can provide for them. And innovative approaches to traditional schooling is what has the pandemic shown us that really matters and makes a difference in these kids' lives across from US to Colombia to India. So really thinking about innovative strategies, for example, information and communication technology, good use of them, non-formal learning centers, mobile classrooms, taking the bus to a community instead of thinking about how the child can take so many hours to get to school, or virtual or in-person mentoring for students in addition to what the kids can get from virtual learning. So yeah, this slide, I'll just skip it, thinking about the time, but in our paper, we're also talking about what kind of opportunities we have to grow the understanding of effective practices that can be applied in schools and school systems. And I would like to end with these questions. We are all here today because we understand the well-being of young people, the importance of mental well-being, not only the students, but also the educators. But we also need to get to the decision makers, policy makers, and funders to act upon the energy and the passion we bring to this work for the long-term effect of our actions today on the productivity, job skills, and resilience of young generations. So here are the questions that I would encourage you to ask to yourself as well as others around you. Are the educators around you aware of the negative effects of adverse life experiences when they interact with children and young people? Do young people around you have opportunities to share their stories? Do youth in your community have access to people and programs that play an active role in building resilience? Are decision makers and key stakeholders in your sector informed about trauma-informed practices and policies to support youth mental health? And most importantly, are you taking care of your well-being? I'll end here, and these are just a few resources that I hope you might find useful, and I'll just drop the hyperlinks into the chat box. And here's my email, and I really look forward to our continued sharing and learning and growing from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Manolia, for your beautiful presentation. Oh, there was a little echo, so hopefully you heard me. Thank you, Manolia, for your presentation.
Yeah.
And yeah, I can so relate and also feel hope talking about that you can overcome trauma and adversity. And I love, the part, and Bassem also mentioned it, about youth participation, really, youth-led education. It was also mentioned during one of the other Learning Planet Festival webinars this morning. Involve youth and ask them, and see them as whole persons. This is also something you mentioned, and have real heart-to-heart relationships with them and talk about it. Try to open up. So thank you. Whole child development. I think we have a great picture of that. So I would like to give the floor now to my colleague Mark, as he will be hosting our panel discussion. Mark, can I give the floor to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Marlene, and thank you, Manolia, and thank you also to Bassem before, and all the great voices we've heard today, Jim at the top of the program. I tried to share with you just a brief contribution from our community just in the days leading up to today's session. from students and teachers all over the world, we collected some testimony, and that is indeed what I was trying to share previously. I'll give it a quick go. If it doesn't work, we'll just back up. So here we are. Make sure my audio is sharing. Sure. Okay.
I'm Madina Barbalata. I'm from Romania and I'm a high school student.
Yo Kendo, soy estudiante del grado 10º, soy de Colombia.
Aldrin, here in the Netherlands, and yeah, I teach English.
I'm Prem Madhav, the principal of Parikrama Junior College. Being confined in 4 walls and not being able to share anything with anybody.
I was feeling like I can't breathe.
Definitely financial problems.
Debimos acostumbrarnos de un momento a otro a la virtualidad.
All these small and little things that I used to do with my friends.
To observe everything, all sorts of information.
I felt exactly as a hostage in his own house.
We are a very hugging school, right? We believe in hugging everyone as soon as we see them. The loss of that connection.
Then being alone a lot and staying motivated in school.
Privacy, and also I was lacking with encouragement.
Media and all the negativity that was around us.
The students seemed more exhausted, lonely, and with low morale.
If you're constantly in that environment, it gets really hard to still study.
It was very difficult to understand if they were able to understand what we were teaching.
When you lose something, you gain something. That's what I'm thinking.
Building lesson plans that worked online, that would involve the students and keep them interested.
Es manteniendo la calma y buscar el lado positivo de lo que estamos afrontando.
If the school, you can't come to the school will come to your doorstep.
In online classes, we came back to studies again.
So we went about providing food to our children.
When you see your parents smile, your grandmother smile, you feel happy too.
People provided meals for others, they helped each other.
I picked up music.
I read a lot of books.
Cooking and gardening.
Online games that I play with my friends now.
I had my friends. We cheered and helped each other.
Definitely my family, because they check in on what I'm doing in school and everything.
Start to join in different conferences, different online meetings.
I developed how much I love video calls.
There are movies I watch with my parents that I might not have.
Don't blame the situation. Live in it. Make it better.
Creativity started increasing.
Critical thinking and problem solving.
Ensure that the children are always learning.
Working with children was important because helping them was helping me.
The challenges come, we face them with a smile and run every race to the last mile.
So I want to make sure to say thank you to all students and teachers from around the world who submitted over the last few weeks. And if you didn't see your face in there, we still have 1 or 2 more that are out there. We'll publish them via our YouTube channel or somewhere there. With no further ado, I would like to introduce our panel of experts. We have Dr. Susan W. Gitao from Kenya, a counseling psychologist. Hello, Dr. Susan, and I'll just read down the next few names before I come back to you, Dr. Susan. We also have Simon Martinez Abadia from Colombia. He's a musician, a cultural manager, and also an educator in Bogota. Hello, Simon. Ashley Namiro from Denmark. She's the senior MHPSS technical advisor for the MHPSS Collaborative. Hi, Ashley. And of course, Dr. Shekhar Seshadri in Bangalore, child psychiatrist. Great pleasure to have all 4 of you, and also to get to see you. It's interesting, somewhere in the survey was that aspect of teachers struggling with students not using their cameras, where here we are as students using our cameras, possibly as teachers as well, and there is something encouraging about it. I want to bring one question to each of you, but after an initial answer, I would welcome open discussion if you have something to say on these subjects. Is Dr. Susan Gitao with us? Because one of the questions I have Oh, I heard Marlene almost saying something. I think Dr.
Yeah, no, I don't think she's with us. She was mistaken in the time.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with Dr. Seshadri, if I can. It's really a question for each of you, but when it comes to the regional and the local, we've been looking at research on a larger level, global, and there is a lot that is shared between both educators and students. But I'm curious, Dr. Seshadri, what have you seen when it comes to this issue of trauma over the past 1.5 years that young people have had to cope with? Give us a snapshot of how it looks out your window to the world or to your country or to your region.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that question. Let me predicate my response on a basic truth. Pandemics of the nature of COVID have a disproportionate impact on the more vulnerable populations, the migrant workers, the daily wage workers. And I think partly in Manolia's presentation, she has referred to this, and I think we need to recognize that where youth and mental health are concerned, while there may be commonalities and generic truths, no one youth is similar to another in terms of categories and contexts that they come from. And the context of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, which has been an everlasting pandemic. COVID is a current pandemic, but adverse childhood experiences has been an everlasting epidemic. Some of the reports, not just in India, but in other low and middle income countries, which look at the whole issue of, let's say, child labor or pre-existing parental issues in the family and an escalation of either witnessing or experiencing violence and so on, is just one aspect of the context that Manolia referred to when she spoke about abuse and bullying and family circumstances and so on. On the other hand, there is the whole development of identity and aspirational dynamics and what the pandemic has done in terms of gap years and so on. So to put this in perspective, in terms of education and mental health as schools open, whenever that happens, it's not just about safety protocols or about the learning gap. I mean, children are natural learners, except for the outliers, and some special attention does need to be given to children and youth with special needs, and particularly to preschoolers. I know that the emphasis on today's session is on youth, but we must think about the 4, 5, 6-year-olds for whom learning is a social experience, and when the social element is taken away, what does that do to? So it's not just about safety protocols and the learning gap. From what circumstances are children going back to schools? Have they lost a parent? Have they lost both parents? Have they witnessed an escalation in vulnerabilities within the family? What kind of situations do they come from, which actually exacerbates the kind of anxiety or distress that they may feel? So this issue is important to keep in mind, to capacitate and sensitize teachers, not to get into a flack about learning, but really look at the personhood and identity of the students as they return to school. Finally, Mark, I'd just like to say that in the last 18 months, we have been implementing a national initiative on child protection and mental health across the country. I've taken the liberty to put the links on chat, and we have an extraordinary amount of material. I will put it back on in a bit. For all of you to, all this is in public domain free access because we don't believe in copyright, we believe in copyleft. And we want people to use this material to really recognize, and this is exemplified in just one story, and I'll end with this, and perhaps time permitting, I'll come back. So a 37-year-old techie comes back to school and meets his teacher who's on the verge of retiring and asks her, "Teacher, do you remember me?" And she looks at him and says, no, child, I don't, because at age 14, he was a cherubic, innocent looking person, pretty much like what Mark might have looked at age 14, but now he's bearded and then so on and unrecognizable. But he says, teacher, I've not forgotten you. I don't know whether you recall, I come from a terrible family situation. And truth be told, I have not reconciled with my family. One day things were terrible at home. I don't know what it is that you saw on my face. You did the dignity of calling me aside quietly and you asked me what the matter was. I told you what the matter was. You did. It's not that you did anything great, but you just said it must have been so difficult to keep that in your heart. I'm so happy you shared it with me. Please don't hesitate to approach me in future. If there's anything I can conceivably do, I would be happy to do so. And teacher, I have never, ever forgotten that act of kindness. It is a simple first level response. So to summarize what Emil Vygotsky says, the classroom is a collaborative community where you co-construct knowledge about life, about relationship, about conflicts, about conflict resolution, about identity, about well-being, and then create a personhood and a citizenry that is based on that vibrancy where well-being is maintained. Mark, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shekhar. It's really a pleasure, and a good story always helps, just like in the classroom. I want to call in on maybe on a similar question. Ashley Namiro, I see you out there. Good to see you. And, you know, there's this question indeed of, in your local context, now you're there in Denmark, but I know you also have your eyes on other contexts in the world. And just add on to maybe what you have not yet heard in today's session when it comes to what young people are going through, or what you have your eyes on in terms of both the experience and then later perhaps we can get to policies.
Thank you so much for that question, Mark, and lovely to be with you all on the webinar today. So I think a big thing that the mental health and well-being of students was really highlighted as a core theme that came out of the COVID pandemic and continues to come out as a core theme. I remember when the pandemic hit in March 2020, I was working with teams in Uganda and South Sudan and really trying to think through their education response plans. And all of a sudden, this big shift happened to how do we provide caregivers, children, teachers with mental health and psychosocial support. That became such a huge area of interest. And one thing that I still think about today is how do we ensure that an education response, whether we're in a pandemic, whether we're in a crisis setting, a natural disaster setting, how do we ensure that any education response is constantly thinking about mental health and well-being of children, teachers, and caregivers? And I think as we've all seen, we've heard many of the speakers and panelists talk about today, but just the extreme mental health effects that have come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think, you know, a lot of those problems were very apparent before. They just weren't brought into the light as they really were with the pandemic. And I think what we've heard from other panelists too is just how important schools are for serving as a place to promote well-being, to protect well-being. And yeah, Mark, I'll hand back over to you, but happy to answer the question around policies as well.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I definitely want to come to that in, let's call it the second part of this panel session. But indeed, you both initial answers, as I prepare to turn to Simon, but remind me very much about, indeed, that the school is not just a place so-called for learning from books, but it's this life, social community. You've said all the key terms. I'm just a great summarizer, or great summarizer. But, you know, this is not necessarily a truth that I think everyone in sort of everyday life realizes, perhaps until moments like this. There's something about a pandemic to just show the truth that has been there for, as Dr. Shekhar said, for a very long time, you know, a problem that has been there for a very long time. I want to invite Simon Martinez. I see him on camera pondering, thinking. And I want to invite you, Simon, to talk about your unique experience in Colombia with the issue of trauma and using your unique approach, both through dance, but also how you use movement to address a lot of the issues that we've been describing that young people are not just going through during a pandemic, but indeed have been going through for some time. Share us your experience and maybe what you've learned.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos. Gracias por la invitación. Yo hablo en español, entonces Nicolás va a ser de traductor.
I'm going to be translating here. Hello.
Lo primero que nosotros identificamos cuando empezamos el trabajo es la idea de que las ideas o el mundo de las ideas tiene un principio, la universalidad.
So one of the first things we found when we start working is that the world of ideas has one central idea, and that is universality.
Y el cuerpo es la definición contraria, es el yo, es lo único. Cada cuerpo es único.
And the body, it's the opposite, it's the self, it's the unicity.
Entonces, nosotros trabajamos en función del trauma desde el cuerpo, porque
So
desde ahí podemos...
So we work in terms of trauma, we work with the body because that's how we can work in our own self, in our own specificity, unicity, sorry.
Lo primero es que Colombia es un país que está en guerra. Somos los primeros en asesinatos de líderes sociales, estamos en los primeros lugares, los primeros en asesinatos de líderes ambientales, 96 masacres, el 15% de la población es desplazada.
The first thing to keep in mind is the Colombian current situation. Still, there's been some improvement in terms of conflict. We're still like number one in the first places in terms of displacements, in terms of social and environmental leaders being murdered, and the general situation. It's not the best. There's still an ongoing conflict here.
Y también, pues, sufrimos de la pandemia.
And we also had a pandemic.
Entonces, ¿cuáles son las fuerzas que nosotros vemos que pueden afectar a las personas en ese contexto?
So we have identified certain forces that affect people in this context.
A todos, el miedo, una fuerte desconfianza y imposibilidad para pensar en lo colectivo, porque este proceso aísla, igual que la pandemia.
So as like pandemic, like this same process has some of the first features are number one, distrust. ¿Me repite porfa las tres, Simón, rápido?
Miedo,
so fear,
desconfianza
distrust,
y dificultad para lo colectivo.
The inability to think collectively, the inability to think in terms of society, of a group, of a community.
Y en las víctimas es mucho más pronunciado y además hay una fractura importante en la vida emocional.
So in terms of victims, this is even more important, and victims would cause ruptures in their self, in their being.
Entonces, ¿qué hacemos nosotros? Trabajamos en 4 etapas.
So we work in 4 different stages.
Primero, autopercepción. Espacios donde la gente puede definir quién es, explorar quién es y buscar y poder decirlo como quiera.
So first of all, there's perception spaces for people to be free to explore who they are and to express it freely.
Segundo, fortalecimiento de la autoestima. Es decir, que ya identificada mi identidad, yo valore mi identidad y la considere bella, importante y valiosa para el mundo. El orden en ese sentido es, primero, valoro mi cuerpo. Segundo, valoro mi memoria y mi historia. Tercero, y finalmente, valoro mis ideas.
Uy, espérame porque esa me la botó grande. So second is self-strengthen. So self-strengthen of ay Dios mío, autoestima. Self-esteem. So it's now that I know who I am, I have to work on that and strengthen that and love who I am and being able to be in front of others of who I am.
Tercero, la identificación del otro, es decir, que somos únicos, que todos somos diferentes. ¿Cómo?
Repítame ese
Oyendo
paso
las
1, 2, 3. Repítame ese paso 1, 2, 3 porque esa se me quedó.
autopercepción, fortalecimiento de la autoestima y lo tercero, soy identificar al otro, identificar que soy único porque hay otros.
So number one, in this step, it would be number one would be self-perception. Number 2 would be self-love and self-validation. And number 3 would be the recognition of others, the existence of others.
Y el último paso es la creatividad colectiva. Puedo crear con otros. Ya fortalecido.
And the fourth stage would be like the capacity to create collectively. I recognize myself, I see myself valuable, I recognize the others, and then I work with them to create something.
Nuestras herramientas para poder hacer eso son el juego, el arte, el diálogo y el cuerpo del que vamos a hablar.
So there are 4 tools for that. Like art. ¿Cuáles que son las 4?
Juego, arte, diálogo.
The like games in general, dialogue, art, and the one we're talking today, which is the body.
Lo que hacemos es creamos espacios y hacemos preguntas.
What we do is that create spaces and we like do questions we ask.
Y en concreto se contesta colectivamente desde el cuerpo, primero individualmente y gradualmente se va haciendo colectivo.
And their answer from the body. First, they start with one person, but progressively they're going to be answered collectively through the body.
¿Puedo interrumpir? I'm going to interrupt here because I want to just focus on one point here because I think it's interesting for the entire panel. And that is the idea of safe spaces. Can I focus on safe spaces? Is that all right? Because I think that's something, of course, that has been challenged greatly, yes, through pandemic and as we've been pointed out, actually, in many different issues around the world. And when it comes to spaces, not that, you know, we all have perhaps a role that we can play, but I want to look at policies from a higher level, if that's where policies are coming from. What is it that you see or that you've been able to identify, whether it's in your country, and this is for all panelists, perhaps on an international level, are there policies, perhaps they were pre-pandemic, or perhaps they're now finally coming forward, inspired or pushed forward really by the circumstances? What is there happening that is potentially a lesson to be learned that could help create safe spaces, as Simon has been identifying that's one of the key elements of his program? Any policies that you'd like to talk about? Give us a little taste. I know there's never enough time. And I'll take it back to perhaps Dr. Seshadri or Shekhar. Now we know each other. Dr. Shekhar, go ahead.
Yeah, Mark, I'm just taking off. Hola, Simon Martinez. I'm going to take off from what Simon said. You know, I'm so reminded as he spoke about his experience of Fred Hickling's work in Jamaica, Dream a World project, one of the areas where, you know, homicide and all is quite, it's about, so space is both a physical structure, but there are external ecologies and there are internal ecologies as well. And many of us believe that if you look at schools or childcare institutions, and if you look at the geography, the architecture of those spaces, they are not a matter only of rights and resources. They are a mental health issue because learning and well-being cannot occur in an atmosphere of constriction. And so if you look at policy and how policy enables, therefore, a re-envisioning of the kind of spaces that you provide for children, even though you may be constricted by economic reasons that the actual geographical space is 10 feet by 12 feet. But how do you equip it with materials, and how do you equip it with activities and with conversation and music and theater? So the space then, in the words of Rudolf Steiner, become anthroposophic. So you almost bring the world back into these spaces because with COVID, there may be restriction of mobility. There can never be restriction of imagination. And that's what we need to provide, to be able to imagine a world, to be able to imagine an identity, to come out of what, from a mental health perspective, is a key element of what all of us are dealing with, and that's intolerance of uncertainty. It's a pan-diagnostic phenomenon: anxiety, compulsive hand washing, cleanliness, distress, anger, frustration, but it's intolerance of uncertainty. So how do you bring predictability back in the lives of children so that they regain what has happened? Loss of routine, loss of structure, loss of predictability, loss of educational opportunities, loss of social spaces, loss of peer interaction, and loss of play. And it's the reclamation of these that you really structure the mental health. And all this is happening through the kind of policies that at least the government of India has taken, and which is why the initiative that we have done is truly transdisciplinary in 4 verticals: mental health, education, child protection, and policy and law. A judge needs to know that it's not just evidence gathering. Who are you taking evidence from? Is this a 6-year-old? Is this a 14-year-old? A mental health professional needs to know it's not just about diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder. It's about helping the child in court processes. Similarly, a teacher needs to know the ecology and circumstances that the child comes from. So transdisciplinarity is the answer, is the key to the kind of dialogue we are having. Simone.
Yeah, I see your hand. Go for it.
Volviendo al espacio o tomando también donde lo debe el doctor Shenkar, yo creo que es muy importante la participación.
Going back to what Dr. Shehari has said, he thinks it's very important participation.
Para eso creo que el espacio, la herramienta más sencilla, simple y con más impacto.
For that, the simplest and most powerful tool
es la pregunta.
And just
en los espacios.
It's just questioning. It's to foster spaces for questioning.
La pregunta permite la participación y parte del principio de que tengo en cuenta al otro, de que tengo en cuenta a los demás, a quienes pertenecen a un espacio, a quienes están en un espacio.
And questioning, makes the response the space for that, but also it makes us aware of the other and that we are in a space and in a group.
Y creo que en este momento, dentro de una pandemia donde el aislamiento ha sido tan fuerte,
and within this pandemic where isolation has been so strong,
es muy importante que los espacios pedagógicos permitan el sentido de pertenencia, la valoración y el entendimiento de que yo soy importante y hago parte del espacio.
And because of that, it's very important that these spaces talk about self to belonging, that I'm part of a space, and by being part of the space, I participate in that space.
En ese sentido, mi invitación es a generar espacios pedagógicos en donde lo que yo llevo más que respuestas y herramientas construidas son preguntas.
In that sense, I invite you for creating pedagogical spaces in which more than answer, there are spaces, there are questions and a space for questioning and for dialogue.
Que permitan la participación y que cada quien pueda hablar desde su identidad.
That allow for participation and the fact that everybody could speak from their own identity and experience.
Y finalmente, el invento y la creatividad.
And finally, through the invention and through creativity.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, and Ashley, I know you've been listening to the several rounds here, but come on back in. What are you thinking and reflecting on this topic, both of spaces, but also of questions, anything?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to point out, I found this really interesting statistic. So the World Health Organization publishes a mental health atlas, and it actually stated that 53% of member states currently report the existence of a standalone or integrated mental health policy for children and adolescents. So in the continent of Africa, this drops down to only 29%. And I found this really interesting because I think there's been some great strides that have been made. So you asked around policy to promote mental health for children. And for example, the Minds Act, which is a policy that's going through right now in the United States, and it's looking at putting mental health in foreign assistance. So any humanitarian emergencies that the US Foreign Assistant Office is funding has to include funding for mental health with a specific focus on children and families. So I think what has really come out of this pandemic is that we're now realizing, it, as has been mentioned, that for children and families to thrive, that it's not just simply putting them in the classroom. As you said, the classroom needs to be a safe space. The classroom needs to promote mental health and well-being. And for teachers as well, that this is looking at the entire community. I think what we've seen is when the Mental Health Atlas is done in 2022, we're going to see this number really, hopefully, increase. Because as I mentioned, what the pandemic has taught us is just how important mental health and well-being is. And we've seen it a lot at the country level too, where you had education response plans, for example, in Uganda that mention maybe well-being once in the whole entire document. And we're really seeing a shift in that, so that it's really more written predominantly. And I think there's one thing for it to be in the policy and another thing for it to actually be rolled out in practice, right? And I think that's where we all come in as humanitarian actors, global actors, people working in country to make sure that these policies actually come a reality, and that they're not just something that's beautifully, eloquently written on a nice document, but that they're realized and demonstrated in our everyday practice.
Yeah. There's always so much more to discuss. As we approach the end of this session, I would invite you to do something that is often encouraged in the media world, but I don't want to focus on small bites, but still, if we are potentially approaching towards some sort of end to the pandemic in the coming year or see, I'm always thinking about the question, speaking of asking questions, what have we learned? We as neighbors, as community members, as educators, as students, and of course that list is probably long, but if you had in a phrase or two so far, if you're keeping score, what would you say we as a society, we as a global community may have learned, as far as we know so far? Dr. Shekhar, no pressure, but...
No, not at all, Mark. One of the issues here is really about creating memories for children. You ask anyone, what do you remember about your childhood? You'll remember that which is a stable memory. And a stable memory is something that happened very often, or it happened once, but it was so happy or so horrible that it's unforgettable. So, Mark might say, you know what I remember about my childhood? I remember that in my family, we had a 100-year-old bell, and it was my job to ring it during mealtime, and the whole family would gather, and there was laughter. And now at the age of 37, 42, it has pride of place in my house. Or Ashley may say, in my family, there was a tradition every week to go to the nearby orphanage and do some social work. And that's why I got my inspiration to do my master's and my PhD. And here I am doing MHPS's work. But you may have an adult who says, what I remember about my childhood? I remember thinking every day, why was I born in this family? All I remember about my childhood is night after night, putting my ear outside my parents' door to listen whether they were killing each other or not. So the idea for those of us who do narrative practice in child mental health, and the application of narrative practice in public child mental health. So the belief in public child mental health and the belief in transdisciplinarity, and marrying these two concepts with the practice of narrative work to actually create memories through activities for children to remember this pandemic, not just as lockdown, not able to meet, not as frustration, but you know what, we did this fun thing. I got to know a couple of things about my dad that I never knew. That, so that's the kind of, in terms of methodology, and how do you use the traction of the digital world to continue doing this training. The national initiative I'm running now, we are operational in 29 of the Indian states now, having reached almost 150,000 service providers and duty bearers. So to really use the traction of the digital world to simulate face-to-face training as near as possible, to bring in their vibrancy and the belief in. And finally, to always remember what Mandela said, which is that the true worth of a nation is judged by the way it treats its children. Or what Desmond Tutu said, if an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you call yourself neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. And finally, what Mark Twain said, in the eternal laws of proportion, the loss of a doll for a child and the loss of a crown for a king are events of the same magnitude. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Shekhar. I want to go to school with you. I want to be in the room. Simon, I would love to invite you as well. I know, making small conclusions is maybe too much of a habit sometimes, but so far, something that we may have learned in the last year and a half, if we have learned anything as a society.
Lo primero, la importancia y la necesidad del otro.
First and foremost, the need for the other, for being part of a community.
Es como perdimos algo que no sabíamos que teníamos.
We lost something we didn't know we had.
Nosotros logramos desarrollar herramientas digitales para todo nuestro trabajo.
We managed to develop digital tools for all of our job.
Pero la primera
I think we just...
Simón, lo perdimos.
Yeah, I think we did lose him, which we can try again.
¿Oyen? ¿Aló? ¿Me oyen?
Now it's good. Sí.
Simón, hágale. Simón, no lo perdimos otra vez.
We'll take a pause because sometimes the connection will come back. And Ashley, if you don't mind, on the long list of things we may have learned, give us one more.
Yes, and my colleague was just alluding to this as he was saying, but just the power of social connections and relationships. And I often thought through this pandemic how I would have handled this as a child in school. If I was told that I wasn't able to go to school, and I just thought the effects of that it would be devastating, because so much of who we are as adults was formed in those childhood years, going to school, interacting with our peers, learning from our teachers. And so not having that space is just devastating. So more than anything, learning how to continue cultivating those relationships in times of humanitarian crisis, in times of pandemics. Because one thing the pandemic did is we were all in it together. And it's important to recognize that children and families all over the world live through crisis and disasters on a daily basis. And so thinking outside of that and just how important those social relationships are in everything that we do, and even more so in people who are living in areas of conflict.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. And Simon, just as you were mentioning digital tools, the ghosts or the things in our connections came alive. But please, if you want to have the final word on what we've been reminded of, or perhaps we've learned.
Perdón, estaba diciendo que a pesar de las herramientas digitales, el encuentro físico, cuando nos pudimos volver a encontrar, esa sensación de alegría fue increíble.
So although we managed to deal with everything with like digital tools, the moment that we were able to meet again, it was of great happiness.
Así que lo más importante, la conclusión más importante es que lo que descubrimos la importancia de poder construir y siempre tener en cuenta a otros y trabajar con otros.
And for me, the most important conclusion is that we have the opportunity to see that we can have the other and build with the other.
Y quisiera terminar con un ejercicio que hacemos, explicarles un ejercicio que tiene mucho que ver con lo que dijo el doctor Shekar.
And I wanted to finish through an exercise that is very related to what Dr. Shekar had said.
Simplemente juntamos gente que es circular, pedimos que, de manera circular, pedimos que cierren los ojos y que traten de acordarse de un juego de la infancia.
We just ask people to gather in a circle, to close their eyes, and to remember about a game they used to play in their childhood.
No importa el contexto, si lo pesado, lo difícil que sea, si es de guerra, si la gente que está ahí es víctima.
Regardless of the context, regardless of the context, espérame un segundito. Regardless of the context, it always works. Whether it's a very tough situation, whether like victims and people of different like sides on the Colombian conflict, this always works.
Siempre esa memoria, ese recuerdo, produce una inmensa felicidad.
Always this memory brings about great joy.
Al final pedimos que cierren los ojos y que por medio del olor, que traten de que la memoria se conecte con un olor.
And then we ask them to close their eyes, and we ask them to connect like their memory of time with the smell of what they remember.
Entonces todas las memorias empiezan a oler a café, a ríos, a tierra, a alguna planta.
So this is usually a rural conflict. Usually the memories are coffee, rivers, the smell of rain, of forest.
Cuando preguntamos si sirve o no a personas que lo hicieron hace mucho tiempo, la respuesta siempre ha sido que tienen guardado en su nariz y en su alma, en su cerebro, una alegría que cuando el dolor aparece, solamente piensan o en café, o en agua, o en tierra, y esa memoria de alegría vuelve. Solamente era para hablar de la importancia de que el doctor Shekar dijo con respecto a la memoria. Muchas gracias.
So regardless memory, when we ask them to remember the smell, because that connects them with the past, with their childhood, with happy memories. That exercise by remembering that smell, that's connecting with the past, with those happy memories that Dr. Shekar was talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you, Nicholas, also for the translation. As I close out the panel here, thank you so much also for helping create this nice list of things we've been reminded of or things we've learned. I want to say thank you to Dr. Shekar. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Simon, for being part of the panel. And I also want to call Marlene back. She's out there as we close out today's session. And thank you also in the chat. I see many people have been sharing both thoughts and projects that are of relevance to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so thank you, Mark, for hosting this great panel session. And also thank you, Nicholas, for translating the beautiful words of Simon. And I have this smell of apple pie now in my memory, because this reminds me of my childhood, my mom baking apple pie, and the family, comes together and shares the pie and shares stories. So the power of stories is also so big, and also the power of imagination. So thank you everyone for taking the time to join as the experts, sharing your knowledge. I think we just scratched the surface of all of your knowledge. And also audience, thanks for listening, taking the time in your busy schedules. And I just, want to point out that this session was part of the Learning Planet Festival. And this is a celebration, actually a week-long celebrations with all sorts of online and offline gatherings. So as we speak, 5 minutes ago, our partners of CAN started their session with El Sistema and talking about the importance of art in education and the influence of art on well-being of youth. So if you're curious, you can just go to the Learning Planet Festival website. That's festival.learningplanet.org. And there's a Zoom link to join their session. I'm going to do that in a minute. And then even on Saturday, so coming Saturday, we have another round table on mental well-being of youth. This is also on the website. You can find the links over there. So, go and check it out. Once again, thanks everyone. Jim, can I give the digital floor to you to officially close this session?
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you all. This has been a masterfully choreographed session, Marlene and everyone. So thank you. And this has been very, very rich. I don't have much time, but I just wanted to underscore 2 points that emerged out of this discussion that I think are really important. One, Dr. Shastari, you made a comment that I think is very fundamental, that at the root of the stress, both for children and adults, as we've been navigating through the pandemic, is the intolerance of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, that's really been what COVID has shattered. Before COVID, we were all pretty sure what was going on. And all of a sudden, that certainty has been shattered, and we haven't been able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And the comment I wanted to make about that is I think transdisciplinarity is certainly at the heart of what we need to be teaching young people. And I would add also, we need to be building up their own inner capacity to be strong as individuals while they are handling the transdisciplinarity. And Ubiquity University has really been focusing on how you build life competencies, the soft skills, how you engage in regeneration, both inner and outer, because I think this intolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty has to be transformed into a deep tolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty. And that requires an inner equilibrium that is resilient, is emotionally mature, and can constantly shapeshift as situations in the external world become increasingly uncertain, because that's the world we're now going into. Is we're in the climate tipping point, right? We're now in a world where the ecology itself is getting more and more turbulent. So I just wanted to underscore, Dr. Shazdari, the points that you were making, because I think they were very, very profound. And the other point among many that all of you raised was from the gentleman from UNICEF, and that is, we've got to keep the schools open. I just think we've got to keep the schools open. And I think even more fundamentally and broadly, people need to be able to, if you're healthy, you should be able to travel wherever and whenever you want. I think we've had enough of the mandates. I think we've had enough of the lockdowns. I think we've had enough of the masks. And whether it's opening the schools for our children, we should be opening society back up and monitoring the situation but within the context of freedom, if you get sick, then is when you quarantine. You don't ever, in the history of the world, have we ever put all the healthy people in quarantine. That has never happened in the history of the world. Once, until COVID. So there's something very wrong with this picture, and opening the schools and opening society, I think, is the right impulse, with the proviso that if you get sick, then you quarantine. And then you figure out with your doctor what you're supposed to do about it. But I don't think it makes any more sense to keep healthy people in lockdown than to keep the children out of the schools. And so I just wanted to underscore that point from UNICEF, because I think that's important as we think about public policy at a time of COVID. So anyway, those would be the last comments that I would make on a beautiful panel. Thank you for all the statistics and findings about the challenges that young people are having around the world. And Marlene and those of you from Masterpiece, I love Masterpiece. What a great organization. What a beautiful way to commemorate and acknowledge our teachers on the International Day of Education. So thank you, everyone. You're welcome to the after chat. The link is in the chat box for those of you who can make it. And we'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same station on Humanity Rising. Bye for now.